Hi, this is Guy Burgess. With this post, I'd like to explain a bit more about what we mean by massively parallel peace building. And maybe the best place to start is to talk about a big reframing that is at the heart of this concept that we're trying to develop. The traditional way in which parties see one another is illustrated in this graphic. And basically, we have the red and the blue, or whatever communities and colors you might want to use to symbolize two sides of the conflict, see themselves as direct opposition, and in one way or another are lobbing threats, insults, attacks, and other back and forth against one another. Now, the first step to making massively parallel peace building work is to convince a sizable fraction within the two contending communities to reframe the conflict. Instead of seeing one another as the enemy, they could come together and look at this destructive confrontation, illustrated with the yellow sort of explosion icon, as the real enemy. And they have a common interest in figuring out what is making this so destructive and how to change it. So basically, you're taking people from being enemies to being on the same side of an effort to fight an impersonal enemy, but one that really threatens their vital interests, that is, destructive conflict. Another way to think about this is what you're trying to do, and I think reasonable people on all sides of a conflict would be supportive of this, is to restore conflict as an engine of social learning. Here we have the basic conflict interaction where you have a plaintiff saying things would be better if you change, and a defendant saying I don't want to change. And usually people exchange, and with respect to some issues they're plaintiffs and other issues they're defendants. But what you really want is some sort of process that makes wise, equitable, timely, reasonably efficient, that is, low transaction costs, nonviolent, relationship-preserving, stress-reducing way of making decisions about all of this. And that's the goal of constructive confrontation. That's the goal of massively parallel peace building. And again, to explain the origin of this kind of crazy techie computer term, massively parallel, this is what runs the big computer systems that have so transformed our world. And it's a lot of very small processors that are working massively parallel, that is, working together on different aspects of a problem, each specializing on different things, and collectively they are able to do astonishing things. This is what we need to cultivate with respect to peace building. Again, this massively parallel effort where lots of different people are doing different things, but it all pushes the system towards an engine of social learning that really works. The Alliance for Peace Building years ago produced a document, Peace Building 2.0. And I know that since then there's been talk of 3.0 and 4.0. I don't really know whether or not they've actually produced these documents. But that's the idea, is that we're trying to come up with the next generation of peace building that starts to do a better job of dealing with scale and complexity. Our goals is to increase the number of people doing peace building work, to increase employment opportunities for peace builders and constructive advocates, to incorporate insights from adjacent conflict fields. It's not just peace building and conflict resolution, but security, political science, law, business. All these folks know things. And certainly a lot of cultural institutions, religious institutions, know things that can contribute to the overall effort. We're going to need to figure out how to lower costs. If you can lower costs, you can increase demand, increase productivity. The iron law of supply and demand works. If we're going to make this happen, it's got to be affordable. And encourage people to work on all aspects of the peace building problem. Right now, people tend to follow fads, things, everybody's into dealing with one problem when we got to deal with lots of other ones. So again, as I've highlighted earlier, it's a strategy for better dealing with scale and complexity. Or put another way, we talked again in an earlier post about how the big evolutionary advantage of humans, in addition to language and conceptual thought, is the ability to make tools. And tools tend to be complicated systems. What we're talking about here is how to construct a complex tool that works at the level of social ecosystems, not just the level of simple mechanical contrivances. There's this chart which came out of the war in Afghanistan that was widely derided as PowerPoints that had gone amok. But if you look at it carefully, it raises an awful lot of the issues that any effort to try to transform and build peace in Afghan society would have to address. And so what we're, in a sense, trying to figure out how to do, not just for Afghanistan, but for the United States and pretty much any society, is to figure out some framework for which we can get people to work on lots of things like this. In fact, our list of things that need doing is longer than this one. Another way of thinking about what we're trying to do goes back to an old United States Institute of Peace publication called Herding Cats. And this came out of their effort to try to figure out how to deal with intractable conflict. And the fact that people don't take directions, like cats don't take directions very much. And the image is, so somehow you're trying to herd cats that don't want to be herded. And we're sort of taking this metaphor as kind of a step further, where we're not trying to herd the cats, but we're trying to make them smarter so they can pursue their enlightened self-interest and understand and figure out how to use constructive confrontation strategies to protect their interests and at the same time transform the whole system in more positive ways. Another way of looking at what we're trying to do is reflected in, again, an article that came out of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And the realization, this was within the Department of Defense, that a command and control system couldn't command and control down to the level of individual corporals on street corners and give directions on what to do in every situation. So instead they talked about a strategic corporal, that is, giving individuals the skills and the knowledge they need to make decisions that handle conflict situations that they encounter, which are likely to be unpredictable, in more constructive ways. And that's what we're trying to do with the kind of capacity building that's at the core of all of this. Another way to think about what we're doing is the old bumper sticker. Think globally. You need some image of the big picture, but act locally. And the truth is that that's all any of us can do. Sometimes local involves connections to people far away, and it's especially true with the internet and all of that, but we all have to operate on a local scale. The question is how to do so most effectively, and how can we get people up the learning curve faster so they can do a better job. Still another way of thinking about what we're doing, and all of these are in a sense different descriptions trying to get at the same reality, is we're not pursuing a table-oriented approach to conflict problems where you bring together representatives of all the groups and you hash it all out and come to an agreement, though sometimes that can work, and you should by all means try. But more what we're trying to do is a directory-oriented approach, where there are lots of different folks doing different things that are all sort of independent, kind of like all the different businesses in a phone book. There's another image which I should have used for this, but I couldn't find it, is the United States Institute put together a directory of all the organizations trying to help build peace in Afghanistan. And so we need a directory of all the organizations trying to do that in the United States or any other country. It's also a decentralized full hierarchy approach. So it doesn't rely on a few leaders who give orders to everybody else. But there are things that can be done at the grassroots level, really at the way neighbors treat one another. There are things that can be done at the mid-levels of interest group organization, and there are things that can be done at national levels. It is an incremental approach, and this goes back to a critically important insight that came out of the work of Charles Lindblom years ago, that argued that policymakers shouldn't work for grand utopian solutions, but what they need is instead a way of approaching social problems that continues to monitor what's working, what's not, where the bottlenecks are, and then when you encounter a problem, especially a problem that everybody agrees is a problem, you try to identify ways of fixing that. And you can have just small groups of people working on a particular problem, again, to go back to this Google Map metaphor that we used earlier. So what we with massively parallel peacebuilding have done is we've tried to group the things that need to be done into 10 major categories, and within each of those there are at least another 10 things that need to be done, and depending on how you phrase them and conceptualize them, the list could certainly go longer. But people need to be able to figure out what's going on. This is the think globally part. There are a lot of things that folks need to do to defend and promote democracy, especially in the face of direct attacks on that from these divide and conquer provocateurs. There's a lot of stuff that has to do with how you frame or think about a conflict. There are more and less constructive ways of doing it. There are another whole set of issues surrounding with how you think about the past and envision a future and come to terms with unrightable wrongs. There are another set of challenges associated with limiting and reversing the escalation spiral, promoting more accurate communication and trying to limit misunderstandings, obtaining and effectively using real facts. There are facts in the world, and if you don't pay attention to them, they're likely to come back and bite you. There's another whole set of things on how do you actually work together collaboratively and take advantage of those opportunities. Promoting good governance for when you can't really agree and somebody's got to decide. And promoting the invisible hand, making the market economy work for everybody and not just a few. So in some of the upcoming posts, we're going to have a whole post on the things you can do, which are going to look at the various action items and try to give you a little more sense of what exactly it is that we're talking about within this rubric of massively parallel peacebuilding. There's also a post that has the whole list of all of the things that we're listing, but not a video on that. And this, again, as I said, we will be developing over the next several months. The other thing that we're going to address is what we call second, third, or fourth order problems. These are the problems that tend to arise that prevent you from being able to deal with first order problems that I talked about in the previous list. Another key post is one on why this isn't such a crazy idea. The truth is, this is the way societies do big things. And there are lots of precedents, and we'll talk about those. And this isn't so nuts or crazy. In fact, totally apart from anything we might do or any influence we might have, something like massively parallel peacebuilding is an emergent property of the entire system. And that's the way society is going to figure this out, if in fact it does. And all we're trying to do is encourage and support this natural process. Now, there are 4 key applications that we're imagining right now over the near term for the materials that we're producing in this context. One is we're going to expand the section of the Beyond Intractability website that highlights things everyone can do to help. And these are not things that take huge organizations, but literally are things that most everybody can do. We're also going to be expanding this seminar series in the Frontier seminar and get into the underlying theory and the details of how all of these things work and what needs to be done and why. And this is something, as I mentioned again earlier, is a frontier of the field idea, and we very much solicit and welcome and would appreciate and need your input in all of this. Another way in which these ideas can be used is there's a different approach to some of the community dialogues that are taking place from people on both sides of the big social divides. A lot of those have focused on trying to get people to understand one another and what their underlying differences are, and to do so in a respectful way. That's something that is still very much worth doing. But we suggest a different set of tasks that these kind of groups might do. And this again goes back to my initial reframing, where what you want to do is get people to start thinking about the destructive dynamics that are tearing their world apart and how they can work together to address those dynamics. So it's not just talking about differences, but actually getting down to working together. And there's also an application in this for college level classes in peace and conflict studies programs and lots of other programs that deal with social issues and want to do so in a constructive way that will actually be reasonably successful in advancing the interests of the various parties. So hopefully this gives you a bit more of an idea of what we're thinking about. For the next post, we're going to start looking at the specifics and also start looking at why this isn't such a crazy idea and why it actually just might work.